here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's August 11th here in Seoul. I'm Xin, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Cheska Dainha.
Happy Friday, everyone!
Happy Friday! And Walter Lee.
Lovely to be here.
Now, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. Our first story. A cafe in Korea has decided to ban people in their 20s from entering. A picture of a poster hung on the cafe's door went viral. It says no 20s zone and specifically bans those in their 20s who are working or are students. Most assume this was because this age group makes up a big proportion of customers who stay at one cafe for hours while only ordering one drink. The actual cafe owner hasn't provided an answer yet. Moving on, government data shows that the number of foreigners coming to South Korea for medical treatment or cosmetic surgery is ticking back up. The Korea Health Industry Development Institute found that the number of these so-called medical tourists more than doubled in 2022 compared to a year ago. Before COVID-19, most were from China, but now we're also seeing tourists coming in from Japan, Thailand, and Vietnam as well. And for the past 2 weeks, one of the main headlines on the news had to do with how the World Scout Jamboree in Korea experienced a drastic turn of events. From heat waves to hygiene issues and eventually Typhoon Kanoon forcing scouts to leave the campsite and continue their adventure in the capital, this year's Jamboree definitely did not go as planned. Nonetheless, some foreign outlets like the BBC lauded Korean government's efforts to provide air-conditioned buses, more personnel, and new accommodation for scouts. Now, due to the typhoon, some 37,000 youth and adult volunteers left their original venue in Saemangeum in Jeollabuk-do province. They were moved to 128 accommodation facilities in Seoul and are participating in various programs offered by local governments. As part of the closing ceremony, a K-pop concert will be held at Seoul World Cup Stadium later in the evening. And while foreign outlets are lauding some scouts and their parents have gone out on press interviews saying how much they enjoyed this experience and Korea's kindness, local news outlets and the public don't seem to be too happy. Now, I'd like to ask our panelists in the studio to sort of represent the local public and news outlets on why they aren't too happy compared to foreign press and scouts.
Right. So, yeah, though this is a kind move by the government, I do think, the government were right in some way to do this. I think they should make better efforts to spend taxpayers' money. Now, I completely understand the reasons for moving the Scouts into the Seoul capital because obviously they decided to run this event at a time where Korea is not the best with weather. We have those very, very hot days and there was problems with heat stroke with certain people in the event. And then we just obviously had a typhoon. So
still going through one right now.
Still going through one right now. So I think it was a very bad choice of time to run this event, even though it might be held at the same time every year in different countries. But
exactly.
You still need to take this into consideration. But yes, I'm with the citizens to say that we should really be possibly spending taxpayers' money a bit better than just this situation. And they're going to have a huge concert tonight, which seems fun, but that's still taxpayers' money that we have to use.
Exactly. I think the public is raged by the fact that their tax money is going into so much, whether that be holding the Jamboree in the first place, but also covering up and mending all the things that have happened. But then again, as you mentioned, they can't control the weather.
Yeah.
They can't control the time of year, given that it is annually held during this time of the year. What do you think, Cheska? What are your personal thoughts on the way that this year's Jamboree, I think it was the 25th actually, turned out, and how officials here in Korea reacted?
You know, hearing the different sort of perspective from different news outlets, you know what it reminded me of?
What?
I think Koreans have this culture of you have to go the extra miles to greet your guests.
Oh, that's so true.
And these people that are coming in is a guest to our quote-unquote nation. And the fact that they weren't prepared for certain things, I think sort of let a lot of the public down, that we weren't prepared as much as we could have been. Now, I completely agree with the weather. That's something that I don't think anyone should take the fault for. But I do think there are some parts of it that we're calling the get to after the death.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of regret in me as a Korean that we could have prepared better to give better impression of Koreans and, these students visiting Korea for the
You
first
mentioned
time.
a very fascinating point. There is that cultural concept of where we have to greet our guests. You remember, if you invite your friends over or family relatives, you have to give them like servings of food, more than they can even eat, because that is our way of showing courtesy.
Exactly. You keep asking them even though you know they've had
You know
nothing.
they're full, but you still want to offer that. And I think that's a really good point you mentioned. And that was our news feed for this Friday. Let's now head into our discussion topic of the day. Tipping isn't common in Korea, but the country's largest taxi service, KakaoTaxi, has recently introduced a tipping function. Take a look at the screen to find out what people thought about this. For a long time now, South Korea's not really had a tipping culture. But last month, KakaoTaxi, South Korea's largest taxi-hailing service, decided to enable tipping. This allows users to tip drivers a small amount, around $1 or so, to express their gratitude. The company introduced this service to improve overall taxi service qualities. While this is currently only a pilot project, it has since stirred a lot of controversy. Some users are concerned that this could lead to higher taxi fares. Tipping culture is definitely not deeply rooted in Korea, but some companies are trying to introduce this, like KakaoTaxi. As you saw in the VCR, KakaoTaxi is trying to introduce this so-called tipping service, which has stirred mixed reactions. So here in the studio, Cheska, would you like to tell us a bit more about this?
The VCR explained it very well, but KakaoTaxi is trying to adopt this tipping culture and is literally, quote unquote, to show token of appreciation. So it's not forced and it's very voluntary. So if you love the service and want to show your driver the extra gratitude, you can. However, there's then always the concern of, well, what if it does turn into something mandatory? Or what if you get penalized for not tipping someone? So there are concerns over this, and there have been some surveys conducted in Korea about, Koreans' perception of tipping, and surprisingly, more than half of the people are currently against it. And especially the reactions, I think, were more vehement in the 20s because they already feel the burden of having to deal with the inflation and having to, work. So having to add that extra tip, I think, is a financial burden on a lot of people.
Exactly. And Walter, including yourself, what did you find about this KakaoTaxi's new tipping service?
Well, if I have to try and look at it from a positive point of view, I think the service isn't too bad, but it does show appreciation towards the driver, as Cheska mentioned, and hopefully this appreciation doesn't go ignored by the drivers, and that might motivate them to, let's say, deliver better customer service sometimes. But then, to be honest with you, many people don't actually like talking to the taxi driver as well. So I don't know how much they could do, but maybe drive safer or follow the road rules.
That's a really good point you mentioned. I think because a lot of youngsters in Korea don't really like interacting with the taxi drivers, they find no need to tip.
Exactly.
Maybe that's why,
I think so, yes. But I know that in the past, certain taxis refuse to go to certain places, which I don't agree. I think if you pay them, they should go to where you need to go. But if you were to maybe, let's say, I wouldn't say use the word bribe, but maybe give them
monetary incentive.
Yeah, monetary incentive. Maybe that will, give them the motivation to go to where you need to go.
Okay. And why don't we now talk about how tipping culture has formed in Korea? Is there even a culture? Because I know there are certain exceptions for when you can tip, whether that be at fine dining restaurants or even when you go to a Korean barbecue. Once they grill it for you, you find that need to express your gratitude. But overall, what's the tipping culture like?
I would love to open this up for discussion because, I grew up in the States, so I was heavily influenced by tipping culture. So one of the things that made me so happy coming to Korea is the no tipping culture, because you pay what is written on the sheet, and also the fact that you're not forced to look at the receipt and having to calculate the additional money that you would have to spend on eating out or doing the services. I actually find it very relieving as a customer. So I've never experienced a forced tipping culture. Like you said, I would tip if I felt that I wanted to show my appreciation, but I never felt like I had to. So I'm curious if you guys ever had a tipping experience in Korea.
Yeah, only for me at a Korean barbecue restaurant too, because it's really hot once you grill all your meat in there. I love Korean barbecue, but it's just such an hassle to grill all this samgyeopsal or the sogogi. And I think the more premium restaurant you go to, there is that sort of, not culture per se, but the feeling that you should be tipping. I don't know. Do you agree?
Okay.
Well, yeah. Well, I haven't actually gone to a high-end samgyeopsal place.
Okay, not samgyeopsal, but maybe.
Yeah, but for me, like, yes, I have tipped in Korea at hotels, for
Yeah.
example.
Me too,
So
yeah.
I've also worked in hotels, and so I kind of felt like I also needed to tip because I also received tips while working in hotels. But the person who I gave it to was almost shocked that I gave them a tip. So that's how I know that it's still not very common. And though we've talked about it before, you actually mentioned that people in their 20s, about over half or more, were actually against this. There was something that was trending online in South Korea about a cafe who put out a tipping jar, which is very normal in other countries.
Yeah.
I mean, in Australia, it's almost in every restaurant or cafe.
true.
But this stirred online controversy saying, is it necessary? Why do these people want more money, etc., etc.? So yes, it's still something that is, even though acceptable in some industries, people are still not used to it, and therefore they find it more of an insult.
Right, in most places. I think it also has to do with our country's deeply rooted Confucian culture.
Yes.
We feel like once you are in a specific industry or once you're a customer, you have that right to be served.
Yeah.
For sure. And we also asked our viewers to introduce what tipping culture is like in their country. So take a look at the screen to find out what our global viewers had to say on today's discussion topic. James said, for pre-built corporate groups, usually a buffet, restaurants often include a tip of around 10% in the bill up front. Otherwise, employees have to bear the cost of the tip, which leaves everyone feeling awkward. Deidu Magana said in the Philippines, it's not compulsory, it's always up to the customer. Sometimes other establishments include it in your bill, so giving tips will not be awkward. Chobria said in the United States, the minimum wage for restaurant servers is $2.13 per hour because the expectation is that they'll receive tips to make at least the federal minimum wage. It used to be 18 to 20% of the bill for good service, but now it seems to be 22 to 25%. Thank you so much to all our viewers who shared their experience and what the tipping culture is like in their country. And I can relate to some of them. It's really awkward when you tip. When I go to the States, it's really awkward. And the tipflation, too. We're seeing living costs go up higher. So I didn't realize that you had to tip so much more. Because every year passes, I have to be tipping more, but then you always have to think about how much is most appropriate, how much can I afford at the moment, and stuff like that.
Yes.
So let's add on. How do other countries tip, and what are some relevant policies?
Well, as a person who grew up in Australia, and it's not actually necessary to tip. You can. It's very common in the hospitality industry to tip, such as your restaurants, your hotels, etc. And as a person who's not exactly great at mathematics, it would be very difficult for me to work out percentage-wise.
Yeah, it's
Like
so
10% is easy, but when you get to the 25 or the 22,
25, 22, 22.
yeah,
sorry.
like,
Yeah.
I would be too scared to go to America because I wouldn't understand. Like
That's
I'd
why
have to
you
get
need
a
your
calculator
phone.
out.
Yeah, you have to
and be
calculate it
like-
all the way.
But
You know,
yes.
Walter, for people like you, that's why they write it out on the receipt, actually.
Oh, do
So,
they?
yeah, they have 10, 15, and I think they go up to about 25, and they show
can
you how
circle it,
much.
yeah.
Okay, that's still too much for me. But yeah, so in Australia, it's not compulsory, but it is very common to give, let's say, your concierge, your waiter, your server, just an extra, a couple of dollars on top of it. But in Australia, we have such a good minimum wage that it's not expected. But it's just a little extra bit of icing on the cake.
I see. What about
So say I was in Australia and you served me coffee
Yeah.
and I didn't tip you,
Yeah.
you wouldn't take it as an offense or
Not
like
at all,
anything bad
not
on
at
the
all.
service.
Yeah.
Okay, just a smile would be enough for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's different in the States, no?
Completely different. I mean, tipping culture I think, is the bread and butter of the service industry. And as I think Cho Breyer, one of our reviewer, mentioned, if you come from cities like LA or New York, where it's very metropolitan, there's already inflation. And on top of that, there's something called tipflation.
Yeah.
So I used to tip around, I think, 10 to 15. Now when I go back to visit my family, I think they go up to as high as about 20 to 25.
I know.
And if you go to fancy restaurants, they already state in the menu that 10% tip is already included, and on top of that, you add the service tip on it. So then the Walter's trying to do the
So many numbers.
Percentage?
10 to 25. So the number escalates very quickly. But I also understand, because in America, the minimum wage is very low. So people expect to make up from tips. However, there was a survey that was done just this month, like 2 weeks ago, an article that was published in Forbes, that almost 60% of Americans said the tipping culture is completely out of control. And about 41% of those that were against it said, why are they putting the pressure to make up for the low, minimum wage that should have been done by the government on the consumer side.
And not to mention, with digitization and the advancement of technology, a lot of people are saying, do we actually need these service workers to be at our site? And sometimes restaurants have kiosks along with service workers. So what do you think about that? Do you think that sort of affects the public sentiment towards not needing tipping culture anymore?
I think that's going to heavily influence how we view tipping culture from now on. So I think the more important thing is raising probably the minimum wage for those that are servicing rather than relying on tips. Because I think we've all had experiences before where you've gotten a decent service, but you're not sure how much these services worth.
Right.
They served you a coffee.
Yeah, you ordered through a kiosk and then they gave it to you. So it's like, it's tricky for sure. And because it's such a tricky issue, we actually have an interview with an expert to expand our talks. We'll include her right after this. We're now going to include a professor of marketing from Yeshiva University in New York. It's Professor Shirley Bluestein. Welcome, Professor.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you for inviting me to this so amazing discussion so far.
Well, we can't wait to expand our discussion with you. So my first question is, what do you think about the Korean public's mixed reactions towards introducing tipping services in taxis? Quite negative, actually. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think this is completely natural and expected that the public has mixed reactions towards introducing tipping requests in contexts where tips were never required in the past. In areas where tipping is not the norm, people even in the United States tend to be confused about whether to tip and how much to tip and why they would even need to tip, right? So tipping in the U.S. for taxis, right? This is a very normative behavior, right? So we have all of the information needed, including established norms towards how much to give. But even so, the new tipping arena in the past few years in the Uber and Lyft, which are the context of a rideshare economy, which I'm sure all of you know, created confusion among consumers. So if people in the United States, which is the queen of tipping culture, have strong reactions towards tipping collection in new contexts, it is not surprising to me that people in Korea, where tips are not even norms in restaurants yet, will also show reluctancy to accept this phenomenon to an even greater extent. Now, just to add to your discussion, I feel like it's also important to know how people view tipping. From a cultural perspective, there are areas around the world, mainly in Eastern societies, by the way, where tipping are not seem appropriate at all and sometimes seem as rude to a certain extent. So that could shape people's opinion, right, in different societies. Yes. From an economical perspective, in the US, people tip to mainly compensate, as you said, service workers for their low service wages, because service workers rely on our tips to make a living. Now, in Korea, if I understand correctly, there are minimum wages as well, right? As in Australia, as Walter suggested earlier. So the service industry does not rely mostly on tips.
Right,
so
as you mentioned, right, the minimum wage here in Korea, we're seeing it go up almost every year. It's almost heading towards the 10,000 won mark. But Cheska, would you like to ask another angle to this story, as we mentioned before, digitization?
Absolutely. And Professor, thank you so much for representing those confused consumers when they go to the States. I'm one of them. I use Uber and Lyft all the time, and I'm just, I'm exacerbated by the tipping that I have to do when I use those car share services. But I also think with the COVID-19, there have been multiple complaints towards tipping culture, mainly because now we're seeing fewer servers and more electronic kiosks. Everything is digitized, as Yan mentioned here in the studio. It's digitization and the advance of technology removing the need for tips.
So this is such a good question. These electronic kiosks, as you mentioned, they are the new age of tipping collection system in the US, right? They're using point of sale systems, which collects the tips electronically for every credit card transaction one makes, right? This became a multi-billion dollar phenomena in the US, and it's seen almost everywhere, right? Where people are now asked to tip in bakeries, for takeout, in coffee shops, vendors, you name it. Now, the pandemic moved us all more into the direction of cashless society, to the point that now tips are collected even in self-service establishments, such as in airport kiosks, where there is no direct human service involved. So if you walk into an airport in the United States, you'll see these kiosks, and they offer snacks and books and miscellaneous pharmaceuticals. Consumers walk in, choose the items, they bag their own items, and they approach this, they go to pay with a tips, with a screen checkout, which then asks them to tip. Now, there is no humans there. There are cameras, but no humans. So we're basically tipping a machine these days. Now, this begs the question whether tips have been changing the essence, right? So in the past, tips were given to ensure promptness or for good service, but today we're asked to be given tips with no services attached. So to your question, though, I think that this is actually could cause potentially even more areas of tipping which we have not considered yet. Currently, yes, people are complaining. It doesn't seem that the technology removes the need to tip. If anything, it penetrates into new areas where tips were not collected previously. And now my research basically is mainly to uncover the sophisticated ways that these technological advantages use to nudge consumers into tipping and to kind of show how people react to those.
That's very interesting, and it's quite worrisome too, because we're seeing tipflation. But we'll have to see how things roll out. Thank you so much, Professor. It was a pleasure to hear from you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
All right, and based on what we just heard so far, Walter, do you think we'll be seeing tipping culture form in Korea then?
I don't think it will be a mandatory thing in the near future. I think, though, they will try and maybe implement this slowly, but I can't imagine it being like a necessary thing or mandatory thing within the near future.
What about you, Cheska?
And Walter, you and I had this discussion before the show started, but it was interesting that the professor said in some cultures, tipping is considered rude. Like people would show it as a show off, or doing the extra thing to kind of make yourself look good in front of your peers, as Walter shared his experience. So I think in Korea, maybe we would take it a little bit slow in terms of tipping, and also everything being digitized. I would be a little bit frustrated if tipping expanded into areas where I didn't feel like I was getting the service from
But
people.
as she mentioned, as the professor just mentioned, we might be seeing more of that. So we'll have to see this, especially in a digitally savvy country like Korea. I do not want to be seeing that, but maybe we might.
Putting my phone numbers and ordering something on coupon.
Because maybe we're complimenting the machine to have, taken our numbers. We'll have to see how things go. And that's all we have for you today. We'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Cheska Dainha
Pleasure's always my thank you.
and Walter Lee.
Lovely to be here.
All right, and thank you everyone for watching. Hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week. We are News Generation.